Good evening. Welcome to the Season 12 premiere of The View Up Here. I am your host, Canadian Glenn, and it is September 11th, 2019, and day one of the 2019 Canadian federal election campaign. How fitting. Including tonight, there are 6 episodes until the vote on October 21st. Guess what the subject will be, pretty much exclusively. Tonight, a kind of a more soft overall look at things. As we get closer to the date, there are a few guests that will be on between now and then. An old favorite, a returning rights and security expert, a first-time guest, currently writing for the Canadian election campaign and technology and social media. But that's all I can say for now, because, that's how it is. But tonight, Canada's election, about nothing and everything. I just dropped the first sentence from the show description because now the writ has been dropped. But before today, could you tell that we were days away? In a word, nope. The same lackluster campaigns on social media and television have maintained the same predictable messaging since Parliament rose in June. The party primary slogans have been rolled out, and the only thing they share is the simplicity and vagueness of them all. Trying to keep it simple appears to be the name of the game. Now, will any of them work is the question that will be answered on October 21st. Has the famous line from Prime Minister Kim Campbell been proven accurate? It does seem the game plan of not talking about serious issues in a campaign has more fans than ever inside political circles. Now, by regular circumstance, the party looking to return as government has an interest in calm, steady sailing to the vote. More needs to be done. Stay the course. Don't change now. Or else, them. The party looking to reclaim government, following recent patterns from their provincial counterparts, says even less about plans and gets ripped apart when they do. So it's all about them. Something not working? Them. Do your feels hurt? Them. Life sucks? Them. Never mind what we will do. That's later. Christy Clark, Brad Wall, Brian Pallister, Francois Legault, Scott Moe, Doug Ford, Blaine Higgs, Jason Kenney. They all use the same plan. We are not them. That's it. This is a political phenomenon of the 21st century, coinciding with the rise of ordered populism in democracies across the world. Canadians have witnessed the speed of disruptive change in these nations, not for the better. So what do they have in common? The International Democratic Union is a global right-wing governance coalition that shares methods, technology, tactics, and ideology to get their members elected and in power. Despite the name, today's neo-fascists around the world fill it. What does IDU Chairman Stephen Harper have in store for Canadians? Well, count on the real plan not being mentioned. So, as I said, that was written before the writ was actually dropped. There was something that came online yesterday. I think I saw it, maybe the day before. Do you know who Lewis Black is? Lewis Black is a stand-up comedian. He's, pretty straight, dour fellow, that type of humor. Kind of tells it like it is, without much fanfare. I have a short recording that was posted on Facebook of him during a live performance, taking requests from the audience. It's not really related to the show, but I just wanted to toss it in because I support this statement 100%.
Hey, Lewis. We have an asshole in Alberta called Jason Kenney. How many of you like Jason Kenney? And you all chose to sit in the back. He's trying to bring Trump politics to Alberta. This is from Tom Gillespie. Could you please tell him to fuck off for us? Thanks. Thanks, Tom Gillespie. So, fuck off. Jason Kenney, fuck off.
Thank you, Tom Gillespie. Thank you, Lewis Black. Now, I love that. That's awesome. See? Not everybody's nuts in Alberta. It's just, all the loud ones that get the attention. Okay, what I'm going to start with tonight is just some opinions from really all fairly recently, the last 3 weeks at the most, about what we're going to see in this campaign, especially with the long pre-election writ period, quote unquote, that didn't really see much movement at all. The first thing I'm going to turn to is from August 28th from the Hill Times, from Tim Powers. And of course, Tim Powers is the managing director of Abacus Data, fearing the Seinfeld election campaign. Maybe it's the result of being a little bit older or having been in the political arena for a while, but there doesn't seem to be much excitement in the air heading into the 2019 election. While you now do see lawn signs about and political ads popping up, the energy that usually comes with the national vote hasn't arrived yet. Perhaps fixed election dates have taken away some of the suspense of the voting process. Or we have so much U.S. politics rammed down our throats, we are immune to a quick impulse for our own contest. Maybe it's because we are in a constant campaign mode anyway, or that the leaders don't turn our crank, that the air isn't crackling with anticipation. Personally, I want to be excited about the October 21st vote, but I'm a long way from being there yet. In fact, I fear a dreary, predictable campaign about going forwards or backwards that will have been focus tested up the wazoo and won't, beyond message tracts, touch the big issues of the day. Sure, we will hear lots about climate change, but not likely in any meaningful way. Act or the planet will blow up will come from one corner, while the other corner will implore that affordability hinges on axing the carbon tax. No doubt we'll hear we need to deal with China and manage the relationship better with the United States. But will we get into a proper discussion about the rise of nationalism throughout the globe and its threat to our global system? Doubt it. As global society threatens to make a major turn, we'll probably end up talking more about the Prime Minister's socks and the opposition leader's dimples. 26 years ago, then progressive conservative Prime Minister Kim Campbell was widely quoted as saying that elections weren't the time to talk about serious matters. She took some heat for that then, and has since said that her words were taken out of context. But that sentiment, in fact, has been proven right. Maybe not since the 1988 election, which became in large measure about whether Canada would welcome free trade, have Canadians battled it out on the country's future. Sure, there were some key debates post-Campbell on debt and deficit reduction and healthcare funding, but nothing resembling a sustained, serious discussion about real choices Canadians should be making. Paul Martin tried to preach about transformative change and ended up becoming Mr. Dithers. He became the model of what not to do in modern Canadian campaigns. Talk about vision at your peril. While the current Prime Minister might be inclined to style himself as a visionary modernizer, he is a good transactional politician, like those before him. He has the right trinkets and baubles for the appropriate supportive cohorts. Middle-class tax cuts, as he would describe it, or enhanced maternity-paternity leaves on offer make excellent electoral elixirs. Affordability is supposedly going to be the big 2019 election issue. All parties will be offering some form of an a la carte menu to fill up your pocketbook. None of them is likely going to spend much time leading a discussion or trying to persuade us they have the best strategic plan for Canada over the next 20 years. That, though, is what is needed now. Never mind tired tomes about reopening an abortion debate or the pain of a carbon tax. How about some depth of thought on our challenges with demography, what exactly our foreign policy should be, massive economic disruption on numerous fronts, nationalism's rise, etc. It's hard to get excited about an election campaign that could prove to be quite detached from the actual meaningful matters of our time. 6 weeks of nothing instead of a real battle royale over something is what I fear. I would tend to agree with Mr. Powers for the most part. Next, August 28th, Hill Times, Andrew Cadell. Slogans in this campaign are symbolic of our age. Andrew's writing from Kamouraska, Quebec. Choose forward. It is time for you to get ahead. Together, they sound like something your mother might have told you before you set off for grade 1. But they are actually the slogans of the two main contending parties in the October election. To be fair, the Conservative Party slogan has subject, object, and verb. The basics of any sentence structure, or so I was taught in school, when dinosaurs walked the earth. Speaking of dinosaurs, I note the People's Party of Canada's slogan is strong and free, lifted directly from the English version of the national anthem, written by Robert Stanley Weir. Just down the road from me here in Kamouraska is the home of Basile Adolphe Routier, the author of the original French lyrics of O Canada. I am wondering if the French slogan for the PPC should not be, given their position on immigration, Terre de nos aïeux, which translates to home of our ancestors. But I digress. The Liberal slogan is so grammatically inept, so binary in concept, it is incomprehensible. It is being used by a major party in a multi-party election in a G7 country with a mixed economy. But it is all of those things, because it seems we have come to this. In a society with the collective attention span of a gnat and declining literacy thanks to social media, the shortest, most hipster-sounding line should work. So why not choose me or try the veal? There is some underlying mean-spiritedness in both slogans. So let's parse them for a bit. The word choose is a strike directly at the conservative anti-abortion base. It subtly reminds people that Andrew Scheer and his caucus might, just might, bring back some kind of law on abortion. Even if they deny repeatedly, they would do so. Forward implies that conservatives and everyone else are backward in their policies, candidates, and fundamental beliefs. This does not really jive with the comment a number of years ago by a prominent federal politician. Conservatives are not our enemies. They're our neighbors. They want what's best for their country, just like we do. They want safe communities and a growing economy. They want better jobs and more opportunities for their kids. They want their country to stand for something in the world with the tenacity to solve big problems. Yes, that was Justin Trudeau, speaking on the 2015 election trail. Choose Forward lines up with a whole range of forward-thinking slogans from Liberal parties across Canada recently. Onward was the slogan of the minority Ball government in May's election in Newfoundland and Labrador. And Forward Together was the losing campaign slogan of the Alberta Liberals. Not a good sign. However, given the preponderance of former McGuinty Ontario government staffers in Ottawa, not surprisingly, in 2007 its slogan was, wait for it, moving forward together. And in 2011, forward together. It sounds so much like a voicemail. Choose 1 for forward, 2 for backward, 3 for chaos, 4 to speak to an operator. Meanwhile, the Conservatives, perhaps inspired by Andrew Scheer's rudeness at Acadian Days this summer, are going for the jugular as well. Time for you to get ahead strikes me as a shot at the PM's leadership qualities as head of government. It is also about you, the befuddled taxpayer who complains he or she is paying far too much to the government. I don't know what the NDP's slogan is, but I am sort of hoping it will take a page out of its recent past with the Leap Manifesto and recall the purges of China's Mao with the Great Leap Forward. Of course, all slogans are tested by focus groups. One of the most famous focus groups ever undertaken was by my putative relative, the late Patrick Cadell, an American Democratic pollster. He worked for Coca-Cola in the 1980s when it was contemplating changing the formula for Coke to make it sweeter. Focus groups endorsed the new formula, but were not told the old Coke would go out of production. This led to people stockpiling the old Coke until it was eventually brought back and the new Coke was phased out. Focus groups also came up with the disastrous 1972 Liberal slogan, "The land is strong," at a time of high inflation and unemployment. But at least that was a full sentence. Andrew Cadell is retired from Global Affairs Canada, where he was a senior policy advisor. There is a certain amount of ironic reality to what Mr. Cadell has to say. Next, also from the Hill Times. It's from August 26th. This is from Greg Lyle, who is the owner of Innovative Research Group. Passions, not reason, will determine the 2019 federal election. Emotions trump reason. This isn't news to anyone who has read or heard about books such as Nudge and Thinking Fast and Slow. More and more people are coming to understand that emotions, not logic, drive our decision-making in all parts of life, including politics. So how do voters feel about the key parties and leaders competing in this election? A late June online poll by Innovative Research asked 2,515 Canadian voters to tell us whether they had negative, positive, or mixed views of each of the key parties in the campaign and their leaders. We also randomly asked respondents to list a positive thing about a random party leader and one negative thing about a different party leader. This process was repeated for the parties. Relatively few voters said they saw parties or leaders as all good or all bad. Most voters who had views of parties had some positive and some negative. Generally, if you liked the leader, you liked the party, and vice versa. Those voters who do see parties and leaders as either all good or all bad tend to see them as bad. What does that mean? Well, there are three key implications. First, parties cannot count on unthinking support from their base. No party could count more than 7 or 8% of the total voting public that had only positive feelings about them. That means managing the doubts of your own base voters is an important task, either by priming strengths or reducing weaknesses. Think about what the Conservatives are doing with their messaging when you think about that. Second, your own supporters are likely to be more passionate in their dislike of another party than their positive feelings for your party. That argues for negative rather than positive campaigns, something else that lines up with what we're seeing. Third, the voters that parties need to grow their share of the vote are not undecided voters, but conflicted supporters of other parties. Most of the people who say they are undecided in polls are undecided because they don't know or care about politics and are unlikely to vote. Most of the people who do vote have a party they prefer, but many prefer a party for which they have some negative feelings. To build your own coalition, you need to activate the negative feelings of your opponent's voters to shake them loose. Passion drives votes. For every party, at least 7 out of 10 of their voters are people who have all favorable or mostly favorable views of that party. passion matters even more for smaller parties than the two main parties. That relationship is even clearer when we look at support for each party by the mix of views for that party. The Conservatives and the Liberals go from support in their 80s for voters with all positive views to support in the 70s for those with mostly positive views, and then drop dramatically to 29% among those with mixed views. The smaller parties enjoy less support. The Bloc Québécois does the best, with 65% support among those with all positive views, dropping to 43% for those with mostly positive and just 11% among those with mixed views. The NDP dropped from 59% support among those with all positive views to just 33% for those with mostly positive and just 7% among those with mixed views. The Greens dropped from 47% support among those with all positive views to only 20% for those with mostly positive and just 5% among those with mixed views. For the PPC, only 34% of those with all positive views will vote for them, dropping to just 19% for those who are mostly positive and 4% for mixed views. So what does this mean for the parties? The Liberals are working from a surprisingly small base of favorable views, with just 28% saying they hold all or mostly favorable views of the party, and 27% saying the same for their leader, Justin Trudeau. These numbers are just 2 to 3 points higher than the Conservatives. When we look at the negative side of the scale, we see 37% with mostly negative views of the Liberals, which rises to 42% for Trudeau. Those that have all negative views rise from 19% for the party to 25% for Trudeau, the highest of any leader. On the positive side, voters like the Liberals for promoting equality and diversity, their perception of a positive, competent record in government, and the focus on environment and carbon. Trudeau's positives focus more on personality and caring. Leading the negatives for the Liberals are corruption, lack of fiscal responsibility, and generally negative views of the leader and the party policies and values. For Trudeau, dishonest leads the negative mentions, followed by incompetent and lack of leadership or weakness. Sounds exactly like the CPC advertising book, does it not? So you wonder why that's what they do. Now, this poll was done before the Ethics Commissioner's report, so it is likely concerns about corruption and dishonesty rose from this point. The Liberals and the Conservatives are close to maxing out their support among voters with positive views. To grow, they must reach into the pool of voters that have more mixed views. These voters need to be shaken loose from parties they like better than the Liberals. To do that, the Liberals will likely need to run a negative campaign to tear down their opponents, motivate their conflicted base, and scare swing voters into their camp. The Conservatives are not far behind the Liberals, with 25% holding positive views of their party and leader. On negative views, Scheer is slightly behind the party, with 37% holding negative views and 40% saying the same for the Conservative Party. The Liberals and the Conservatives have similar levels of all negative views, 19% for the Liberals, 20% for CPC. But at 25%, Trudeau's all negative mentions are significantly above Scheer's at 20%. Now, people with positive views of the CPC, like their fiscal responsibility, quote unquote, see them as good for the economy, generally view them as the best and most competent party, or at least see them as better than the Liberals. People with negative views feel the Conservatives don't care about people, don't like their policies in general, or don't like the leader. Their biggest negative in the leader mentions is lack of leadership or weakness. It seems likely that the negative third-party ads asserting that Andrew Scheer's weakness will cost you are having an effect. There is still a fairly high number of people who are not sure what to think about Andrew Scheer, 18%. The CPC will likely need to continue to introduce their leader to Canadians who don't know him yet, if only to prevent Engage Canada and others from defining him first. However, like the Liberals, the limited pool of mostly positive supporters and the intensity of their opponents' negatives naturally draws the CPC into developing a negative campaign, which will drive time for a change voters. Now, for the Liberals and Conservatives to grow, they must attract new voters who have, at best, mixed views of them. While there is some room to grow among voters who mostly or all positive views, it is limited. For the NDP and the remaining smaller parties, this is not the case. They still have many target voters who hold mostly or all positive views of their parties. For the NDP, lack of leadership and dishonesty are both important negative factors associated with leader Jagmeet Singh, but additionally they must contend with concerns that the party has no chance of winning and will only split the vote. Both Elizabeth May and the Green Party suffer from the same issue. Voters believe they only offer a limited platform and focus narrowly on the environment. Their focus on the environment is both their main strength and their main weakness. However, those who are voting Green now show a strong commitment to the party and its leader. Maxime Bernier and the People's Party faced the most negative results in the survey. Many voters are concerned that both the leader and the party itself are too conservative and even racist. However, like the Greens, those who are voting PPC show a strong commitment to the party and its leader, Zigha. The Bloc has the least conflicted current supporters of all the parties in this poll. Almost 90% of Bloc supporters have mostly favorable views. Their brand is a bit like the Greens. They are known for one thing: standing up for Quebec. It is their biggest strength and biggest weakness. Their new leader, Yves-François Blanchet, is the least known of all the leaders. The Bloc needs to start by introducing him to their current voters. And Bloc opponents still have an opportunity to define Blanchet negatively to shake Bloc voters loose. So that's an interesting look at why we see what we see. And so many of us find it pedantic and repetitive and simple. But that's where you get data from. Keep it simple, stupid. We're seeing it for demographics and psychometrics. It's easy. And it sells. You can make money doing it. There's always somebody to buy your data, if they're not commissioning you to make the data to begin with. From September 9th, in the Taillis, Arno Kopechki, so what's a progressive voter to do? We're running out of time. That's the one thing voters from across the political spectrum can likely agree on. Wherever you live, whatever you believe in, whichever leader you most love or loathe, you likely share a belief that things have already gone so far in the wrong direction that society, hell, civilization, now finds itself tiptoeing along several tipping points at the same time. For those of us who consider ourselves progressive, a problematic term, but that's another story, these many points of no return fall under three broad headings of equal and codependent magnitude: climate change, inequality, and racism. Each subject could fill a library, but they can also be summed up in two statistics and a word. First, humanity is dumping 37 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year, a number that's still going up instead of down. Second, the richest 1% on Earth own 45% of the world's wealth. Like greenhouse gas emissions, their share is rising. Third, zooming in on Canada, a crisis captured in one word: genocide. That label loomed over the final reports of both the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which refer to cultural genocide, and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which simply describe past actions and inactions as genocide. In 2015, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission completed its work, the ballot box seemed to offer a much clearer choice for progressives. 10 years of conservative government had cast its black shadow over all we hold dear. In response, a grassroots coalition with connections to savvy nonprofits like Lead Now organized a strategic voting campaign. They informed Canadians from Victoria to Halifax about which candidate in their riding stood the best chance of beating the local Conservative. It worked. Indeed it did. It worked here in Edmonton. But the last 4 years have brought second thoughts about that success. After saying so many of the right things, Justin Trudeau's Liberals compromised and obfuscated their way onto every radical progressive's shit list. The Prime Minister declared a climate emergency, then bought a pipeline. He promised us proportional representation so that we'd never have to vote strategically again, only to renege once he made it past the post. This time around, there's no strategic vote campaign on offer. None of the people who sifted through candidates and ridings and built websites in 2015 have stepped forward, because nothing is as clear as it was then. The Liberals have become too distasteful for progressives to defend, yet the only plausible alternative, a return to Conservative government, offers a watered-down version of Donald Trump's worst instincts. The NDP is fighting for its life. The Green Party surge is good news, but you can bet the Conservatives are cheering it as much as environmentalists. For those looking to hold the Liberals' feet to the fire without handing the reins to Scheer, the best possible outcome is a minority Liberal government in which the Greens or NDP hold the balance of power. But boy, are we playing with fire. A few too many votes in the wrong direction, and we buy ourselves 4 years of Conservative climate denial and bigotry. So what's a progressive voter to do? Progress in a democracy is never instantaneous, and it's always partial. And you can't get cynical or frustrated because you didn't get all the way there immediately. Barack Obama once said in an interview with the comedian and podcaster Mark Maron. That was in 2015. As Obama's presidency was winding down, he was responding to Maron's suggestion that Obama's inaugural campaign themes of hope and change had failed to deliver on their full promise. Obama went on, "Sometimes the task of government is to make incremental improvements or try to steer the ocean liner 2 degrees north or south so that 10 years from now we're in a very different place than we were. But at the moment, people might feel like we need a 50-degree turn. We don't need a 2-degree turn, but you can't turn 50 degrees. It's not just because of corporate lobbyists. It's not just because of big money. It's because societies don't turn 50 degrees. Democracies certainly don't turn 50 degrees. That's been true on issues of race. That's been true on issues of the environment. That's been true on issues of discrimination. As long as they're turning in the right direction and we're making progress, then government is working sort of the way it's supposed to. You could call that the doctrine of incrementalism. Obama invoked it to defend his own record, of course. But if there's a progressive defense to be offered for Canada's Liberals today, that's it. Trudeau, who clearly admired Obama, has modeled his flawed approach on Obama's own flawed pursuit of incremental change. In other words, for all of Trudeau's missteps and compromises, at least we're headed in the right direction. Just as Obama feared the economic impact of replacing America's gargantuan healthcare industry with a single-payer system, for instance, Trudeau is hyper-aware of Canada's economic reliance on the oil and gas sector. So they transition slowly and make a lot of concessions along the way to the industries they're trying to transform. The counter-argument is that the time for incremental change was 20 years ago. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to take but one example, has given the world until 2030 to cut carbon emissions in half if we're to avoid runaway climate change, which is a 50-degree turn and then some. But even those who side with Obama must acknowledge that for incrementalism to work, it has to be sustained, and that isn't easy in a polarized democracy. Enter President Obama's successor, stage right. The biggest backlash in the history of democracy has laid bare the Achilles heel of incrementalism. It also foreshadows the risk facing Canadians on October 21st. But the Trump presidency also set in motion a fascinating, if accidental, political experiment that ought to give progressives the very thing Obama promised: hope. Imagine if Hillary Clinton had won in 2016. The U.S. would be muddling along on roughly the same path as before. Liberal-minded, without threatening corporate elites, Clinton's every progressive inclination hobbled by Republicans. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would not be in Congress. No Green New Deal would be on the table. The choice for Americans in 2020 would have been between the status quo and whichever pizza magnate won the Republican nomination. Instead, for the first time in several generations, Democrats are on the brink of nominating a truly radical progressive. If Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or even Kamala Harris becomes the next president, history will come to view Clinton's loss in a very different light. She had to lose, the books will say. America had to plummet to the depths of Trumpism in order to clear the path for the progressive radical we need in this age of existential urgency. On the other hand, Joe Biden is leading Democratic polls right now. If he becomes the next president, or Donald Trump, whose odds as the incumbent will be better in 2020 than they were in 2016, then Clinton's loss will prove to have been just as devastating as it felt at the time. Then we'll all wish Americans had rallied just a little harder for 4 more years of incremental change. It's a fascinating, harrowing experiment. But meanwhile, we're stuck in our quandary. Reject incremental progress at the risk of a conservative government and rapid backsliding on climate, equality, and other progressive issues, or hold our noses and vote for the turtle. We expect a lot from our politicians, maybe too much. They can only do what we'll vote for, after all. Another thing Obama used to say was, "Make me do it." Mobilize is what he meant, not just politically, but socially. Write letters, get out in the streets, get in the government's face. When sweeping change has transformed democracies in the past, from civil rights to labor unions, it wasn't because some politician had a great idea at 4 a.m. It was because of social movements that grew so powerful it didn't matter who was in office. The only way to stay there was to do what the movement demanded. Thank you so much for that final sentence there, Mr. Kopechki. How come we don't see corporate media talking about our elections in this manner? You know? Nothing and everything. Hill Times, September 9th, Abbas Rana. Choose your poison. That's the ballot question for most Canadians in the federal election, says pollster Nick Nanos. None of the national parties appear to be connecting to a majority of Canadians, and a leading pollster is predicting the ballot question will be choose your poison on October 21st. A lot of this has to do with the fact that people are unhappy with both of the choices, said Nick Nanos, chief data scientist and founder of Nanos Research. It's pretty clear that there's a proportion of Canadians who are disappointed with the Prime Minister, and another proportion of Canadians who are concerned about Andrew Scheer as Prime Minister. I think for some Canadians, if we would sum up the upcoming campaign, it's like, choose your poison. They won't be happy with any choice that they have. Now, according to Nanos Research, the governing Liberals and the Conservatives have been running neck and neck nationally for months. Mr. Nanos said Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Liberals ended the last year tied with Andrew Scheer's Conservatives because Canadians were worried about the economy, had anxiety about USMCA negotiations, the Oshawa car plant closure, and were uncertain about whether the Trans Mountain Pipeline would be built or not. But in February of 2019, the SNC-Lavalin scandal made matters more complicated for the governing party. After the scandal made national headlines, the Liberals were running far behind the Conservatives for weeks, with some polls showing the official opposition in majority territory. In recent months, however, the Liberals have been in recovery mode, and recent polls are showing both parties tied in a statistical dead heat. Now, according to a weekly rolling poll by Nanos Research that came out at the end of August, so less than 2 weeks ago, the Liberals had the support of 35.4% of Canadians, the Conservatives 31.2%, the NDP 15.6%, and the Green Party had the support of 10.2%. That was a poll of 1,000 Canadians, margin of error plus or minus 3.1, 19 out of 20. In the vote-rich province of Ontario, with 121 electoral seats, the Liberals were the choice of 40%, Conservatives 32.3%, NDP 16.9%, and the Green at 9.2%. In Quebec, with 78 electoral seats, the second highest in the country, the Liberals had a whopping 24 percentage point lead over the second place Bloc Québécois. The Liberals were at 42, Bloc Québécois at 17.9. Conservatives in third with 15.4, NDP at 12.1, and the Green Party with 9.5%. Now, conversely, the Conservatives had a massive lead over the second place Liberals in the three prairie provinces. Conservatives at 47.5%, Liberals at 20.9%. Now, those three provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, carry a combined total of 62 seats. The third place NDP was at 19.2%, and the Greens were the choice of 8% on the prairies. In the four Atlantic provinces, with a combined total of 32 seats, the Conservatives and Liberals were tied within a margin of error, 38.5 to 36.9. The Green Party was in third at 12.7, and the NDP at 7.9. Now, in British Columbia, which is expected to be a key battleground in the upcoming election with four-way splits, the Liberals were leading the pack with 36%. Conservatives were in second at 26%, NDP at 19%, and the Green Party at 15%. Now, this poll also suggested that 46.7% of Canadians think that Justin Trudeau has qualities of a good political leader, compared to second-place Green Party leader Elizabeth May, who scored 40.3%, Andrew Scheer at 36.6%, and Jagmeet Singh at 28.6%. But Mr. Nano said people are not showing enthusiasm for any party because none of the parties or the leaders have been able to connect with Canadians. He said voters think politicians of all stripes are interested only in their personal or their respective parties' petty self-interests and don't have the best interests of Canadians at heart. Mr. Nano said voters don't seem to be hopeful that the children will have the same quality of life that they have now. And he said politicians should be concerned about this state of affairs, as this is populist angst and a judgment on the failure of all parties. They should be very concerned because it's effectively a judgment on the failure of all the major parties to advance an agenda, to conduct themselves properly, and to be working for Canadians. For many Canadians, they look at many of our federal party leaders and our federal parties, and they do not see any of them working for average Canadians or working to make Canada a better place. They see them as grubby politicians grabbing for votes and reaching for power. Sound familiar like anywhere else? Mr. Nano said, today not as many Canadians identify themselves with specific political parties as they once used to in the past, and are free agents in an atmosphere of people mistrusting politicians. Moreover, he said Canadians of all ages are frustrated that they're working hard and doing everything required to do, but still are underemployed and don't see a pathway to get ahead. People will go to the ballot box, look down at the choices, and they will probably vote for the party they dislike the least. There's a general malaise and political fog where people are not hopeful. The other thing is people are not loyal to parties the way they were in the past. That's according to Nick Nanos. But Frank Graves, president and founder of Ecos Research, said he expects the next election will be about two different broad visions. A choice between a more open Canada that Liberals and progressive voters believe in, or a more ordered type of Canada, the one that Conservatives and PPC believe in. Mr. Graves said some of the top-of-mind issues for Canadians include immigration, climate change, carbon tax, jobs, and the economy. It's going to be a broad vision war about whether you want to have this more open Canada that Liberals and other central progressive portions of Canada believe in, or should this be a more ordered type of Canada, which puts a greater emphasis on being more cautious about immigration and globalization, less enthusiastic about issues like climate change, less emphasis on science and professionalism. So those two very different models of what the future should look like will be at the heart of this. But I also believe there will be specific, very important issues around climate change, which will be a very important issue. I believe immigration, but not just the level question, but generally what kind of society we want. Do we want a pull up the drawbridge, or do we want to make Canada an open beacon for the world? I think that will be an underlying ballot question. Mr. Graves said the country is divided between those who prefer a populist outlook and those who oppose it, and said Canadians are divided along regional lines. The country is harshly divided into those who really are attracted to some of this new populist outlook and those who think it's really a bad thing. This is also fragmented very much on regional lines now, too, with Alberta and Saskatchewan in a totally different place than the rest of the country. So whatever outcome there is from this election, I believe you're going to see the country really divided. There's no outcome that's going to make most Canadians happy. Well, isn't that comforting, shall we say? Now, let's get to more specifics on the parties. Not a whole lot, with exception for one that we'll get to. This is from Greg Lyle, who is also involved in the polling industry. This is from the Hill Times on September 9th. Counting seats, not votes, has the Liberals sitting pretty. If you're focused on the national horse race numbers, you may be missing the story of this election. If you look closely, not only can you see the Liberals have their votes in the right places, there are pockets of seats that may give the Liberals unexpected gains. As Hillary Clinton and Al Gore will tell you, having more votes than your opponent is not enough to win. Canada's parliamentary system is similar to the U.S. Electoral College. We count seats, not votes. The overall vote across the country does not determine who wins. What matters is how many of your party's candidates have the most votes in their seats. Justin Trudeau is well aware of that fact. In 1979, his father, Pierre Trudeau, won the popular vote by over 400,000 voters, but ended up with 22 fewer seats than Joe Clark. Clark won because he had a better distribution of votes. So where do the parties stand today in terms of the geography of their votes? Now, keep in mind, this came out only 2 days ago. It is early to run models making predictions for individual seats, but we can start to see which type of seats are most likely to provide the key battleground for this election. We have grouped seats into 14 clusters based on the patterns of party competition in 2015 and 2011. We then combined 3 polls with a total of 7,555 respondents to see how the race is developing in each of these riding clusters. The detailed methodology and results can be found on the Innovative Research Group website. When we did this in 2015, we found the Liberals were doing better than expected in moderately strong conservative seats that regional models assumed would stay conservative. In fact, a large number of those seats swung Liberal and delivered a majority government. The Liberals in 2019 start with 84 seats they are unlikely to lose. There are 32 seats they won with strong margins in both 2011 and 2015, where they lead by 21 points today. Another 26 are seats they gained from the NDP outside of Quebec, where the Liberals currently have an 18-point lead. A final cluster includes the 26 Quebec seats that were swept by the NDP in the 2011 Orange Crush and then by the Liberals in 2015. The NDP vote, which was already down to 24% in 2015, has plummeted to 10% this summer. No other party has emerged to rival the Liberals for this cluster of seats. Much of the attention coming into this election has been focused on potential Liberal losses, but almost no one has recognized the potential for Liberal gains. There are 14 seats in Quebec where the NDP either won in both 2011 and 2015 or were very competitive. Since the 2015 election, the NDP vote has plunged from 36% to 11% in this cluster. While the Conservatives at 20% and the Bloc Québécois at 26% are competitive in these seats, the Liberals currently lead at 30%. Now, the Liberals will likely gain seats here. There are 34 seats in Ontario outside of the GTA that have been competitive for both Liberals and Conservatives. In 2011, the Conservatives formed government with all 34 of these seats. In 2015, they lost 18 of them to the Liberals. The Liberal lead over the Conservatives is marginally higher now than it was at the last election. If the Green vote drops from the 15% we see in this cluster today, the Liberals will likely benefit the most and gain even more seats in this cluster. In this election, Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives are piling up votes the way Pierre Trudeau did in 1979. 65 seats fall into a strong Conservative cluster. Most of these seats are in the Prairies, rural Ontario, and Quebec City. The Conservatives have twice as many votes as the Liberals in these seats. An important amount of the Conservative national vote is piling up large wins in these seats. There is only one other cluster where the Conservatives have a clear lead. Most of our seat clusters have a clear regional base, but there are a group of 19 seats spread outside the regional clusters that have been swing Conservative-Liberal seats. They are in rural British Columbia, the Prairies, and 3 in Quebec. Now, the Conservatives won 17 of these 19 in 2011, but only 6 of 19 in 2015. Now, the Conservatives have gone from trailing the Liberals by 6 points in these ridings in 2015 to being in the lead by 7 this summer. A wild card for the Conservatives are the 18 Quebec seats where the Bloc is competitive. On average, the Bloc Québécois secured 30% of the 2015 vote and hold a similar level of 28% today. The Liberals also slipped, going from 29% in 2015 to 24% today. The New Democrats have experienced a dramatic collapse from 27% to 7%. The big winners have been the Conservatives, growing from 11% to 22%, and the Greens, up from 2% to 14%. With fragmentation across 5 parties, plus 4% for the PPC, the Bloc's 28% means they should at least hold their existing 9 seats and could be positioned for gains. However, Conservative momentum in this cluster bears watching. The biggest battleground are 33 seats in the suburbs of Toronto that have been moving back and forth between the Liberals and Conservatives. Some are in the city of Toronto, but most are in the Greater Toronto area. The Conservatives won all 33 of these seats in 2011, but only 3 of them in 2015. They need to win most of them to be on the road to forming government. While the Liberal lead has slipped from 10 points in 2015 to 6 points today, the Conservatives must do better here to make the election a contest. There is a graphic in the slideshow specifically to that point. The Conservatives are doing better in the 14 Atlantic seats that flipped from the Conservatives in 2011 to the Liberals in 2015. The vote has gone from a 27-point Liberal lead in 2015 to a 2-point Conservative lead today. If the election were today, the Liberals would likely lose 7 of 14 Atlantic seats. Now, there are 14 seats that were 3-way races between the Liberals, Conservatives, and NDP. The Conservatives have a 4-point lead over the Liberals, and the NDP only 2 points further behind. These are true 3-way ridings. The Conservatives are likely to improve from the 3 out of 14 they won in 2015, but their lead is still pretty marginal, and all three parties could still gain. There are 11 seats in British Columbia's lower mainland that are battlegrounds for the Liberals and the Conservatives. If the election is close, these will be some of the key seats everyone will be watching. The Conservatives had all 11 in 2011, but only were victorious in 4 of 11 in 2015. The Liberal lead in this cluster is 4 points over the Conservatives, almost the same as 2015, but with the growth of minor parties at the expense of the Liberals and the Conservatives, it raises the potential for shifts within seats. The New Democrats' best chance lies in a cluster of 16 seats outside of Quebec. These include some industrial and Northern Ontario seats, 3 prairie seats, and 5 British Columbia seats. The NDP won 14 of these 16 in 2011 and all 16 in 2015. However, even in this core cluster, the NDP is showing a dramatic decline, dropping from 42% in 2015 to 26% today. Now, this cluster is now a 3-way race between the Liberals, Conservatives, and New Democrats, with all 3 parties between 26 and 30%. That are true 3-way contests. The last cluster is a group of 15 seats where the Greens had a strong showing in 2015. It's also important to the NDP, who won almost half of these seats in 2015 and 2011. These are mostly seats on Vancouver Island, which elected 3 provincial Greens, as well as Elizabeth May in 2011 and 2015, and Paul Manley in the recent by-election in Nanaimo. There is also a scattering in BC's lower mainland, a couple of Ontario and Atlantic seats, and 1 in Quebec. While there may be potential here for a Green breakthrough, so far they have grown very little in this cluster since 2015. The big change is an 8-point tumble for the New Democrats. The Liberals remain in the lead in this cluster, but the Conservatives have cut the Liberal lead in half. This is the most competitive of all the clusters, and the outcome is very uncertain. Now, diving below the surface of the national numbers shows a bullish picture for the Liberals. Many of the Liberals' core seats were NDP seats 2 elections ago. So long as the NDP remain in the doldrums, the Liberals start ahead of the Conservatives. In addition, the Liberals have new NDP seats, both inside and outside of Quebec, that appear likely to move over to the Liberal column. The Tories start with a smaller base and only show potential for significant gains in 2 of these smaller seat clusters. The NDP is truly on death's door. In addition to likely losing most, if not all, of their remaining Quebec seats, the Liberals are threatening the NDP's core English Canada seats. Meanwhile, the Greens are threatening the NDP's Vancouver Island holds. Beyond Vancouver Island, the Greens are struggling to build the local vote concentrations needed for seats. This is an even greater problem for the PPC, whose primary role in this campaign so far appears to be as the spoiler for the Conservatives. The election may appear close when we look at votes, but the Liberals clearly start with a strong advantage when we look at seats. That, I think, is a very good look from a different angle that does paint a completely different picture for this whole campaign. But I can guarantee you, in the quote-unquote war rooms, those people are well aware of what Mr. Lyle's talking about. He's saying there are gains to be had for the Liberals, despite all the noise, despite the overall polling numbers. Well, let's stick along that line for a minute. This is about the oldest article I'm using tonight. This is from June 26. In the Hill Times, from Peter Mazaroux, Trudeau's legislative record unlikely to motivate voters in the fall, with a few exceptions. Now, 4 years of lawmaking has left the Liberal government with a lengthy list of accomplishments and black marks, but only a few legal changes made or abandoned by the Trudeau government will likely play a significant role at the ballot box this October. Again, to quote Greg Lyle, the owner of Innovative Research Group, there's an old saying in politics: friends come and go, but enemies accumulate. No one sends you thank you notes when you pass the bills that they wanted. A handful of pollsters and politicos interviewed by the Hill Times were divided over which government bills, legal changes, or broken legislative promises were likely to influence the upcoming campaign. The Environmental Assessment Reform Bill, C-69, the Tanker Ban Bill, C-48, Abandoned Electoral Reform Promise, Imposition of the Federal Carbon Tax, and the legalization of deferred prosecution agreements via the 2018 Budget Bill, and the CUSMA Trade Implementation Bill were among those that they said could sway voters in October. Issues of affordability and accountability are the top concerns for voters, based on polling by Toronto's Campaign Research, said CEO Eli Yufest. Very few of the government's landmark bills fit neatly into that category. Legislative missteps by the government during its first 3 years, including failing to make good on a promise to reform the electoral system, didn't seem to hurt Mr. Trudeau in the polls either. It wasn't until the Prime Minister's trip to India in February 2018 and the SNC-Lavalin scandal that public opinion of Mr. Trudeau took a dive, said Mr. Yufest. The Trudeau government has passed into law 111 bills during this record-setting session of Parliament, which will become the longest in Canadian history on July 20th. That includes 88 government bills and 25 private members' bills from MPs and senators. Those government bills are Trudeau's legislative legacy so far. They include a handmark of landmark bills that dominated public discussion: to legalize assisted dying, and later to legalize cannabis, to impose a more stringent gun control regime, and more recently, to ban oil tanker traffic on the northern BC coast and overhaul the federal environmental assessment process. Others attracted less attention, but still made waves. The government's move to repeal, through Bill C-6, changes by the previous Conservative government to the way Canada grants citizenship, its move to change and arguably soften criminal sentencing requirements via Bill C-75, a law to make it easier to protect marine habitats, Bill C-55, and bills to implement trade agreements with Europe and the revised TPP members. The government arguably attracted as much controversy as applause to many of its bills, including the Environmental Assessment and Tanker Ban bills, C-69 and C-48, the Solitary Confinement Bill, C-83, the Indigenous Languages and Child Welfare Bills, C-91 and C-92, and the Access to Information Bill, C-58, which was a vehicle for a broken government promise to open up ministers' offices and the PMO to access to information requests. The government also received a firestorm of criticism over Bill C-27, pension legislation introduced by Finance Minister Bill Morneau, and since abandoned to die on the order paper. Mr. Trudeau also alienated some Canadians by failing to introduce other legislation, particularly to make good on his promise to do away with the first-past-the-post electoral system. The Liberals also passed a pair of bills that will change the upcoming election campaign itself. The government responded to criticism over its cash-for-access-style political fundraisers by bringing in Bill C-50 to regulate those events, and it made a series of changes to election advertising rules through Bill C-76, establishing a pre-election advertising spending limit and aiming to block out foreign influence over the vote. 18 government bills are still stuck in limbo of Parliament as the summer break begins, including 14 that were abandoned and later replicated in omnibus bills, and 4 that were not. Bill C-27, the abandoned pension bill, Bill C-99 to change the citizenship oath, which was never debated, Bill C-98 to create independent oversight of the Canada Border Services Agency, which was sent to the Senate 2 days before it rose, and Bill C-100, which would implement the new NAFTA trade deal, and which the government has said it would recall Parliament to pass once Mexico and the U.S. are ready to make good on the pact domestically. Mexico has ratified the deal on June 19th. Now, of course, as I said, this article was from June, so all those bills, they're dead. Parliament has been dissolved. They are gone. If the electoral reform promise, abandoned in 2017, was going to hurt the Liberals, we would have already seen it, said Mr. Lyle. The Liberals are still doing well with the most left-wing voters in Canada. Pollster Shachi Kurl, however, said many voters are still upset about electoral reform. They either punish Trudeau at the ballot box by voting for someone else, or they stay home, said Ms. Kurl, the executive director of the Angus Reid Institute. The government's move to legalize cannabis won't likely help the Liberals much in the fall, unless they can convince Canadians that the rival Conservatives would roll back the legislation. Conservative leader Andrew Scheer rejected the prospect of recriminalizing cannabis last year. Same goes for Liberal bills to legalize assisted dying, promote accessibility, implement trade deals, and help First Nations. People are generally motivated by the potential loss of something rather than the potential gain of something. The government's controversial oil tanker ban bill, C-48, and the Environmental Assessment Reform Bill, C-69, were part of the balancing act the Liberals tried to perform with the economy and the environment. But paired with the government's decision to purpose the Trans Mountain Pipeline, alienating many environmental-minded voters, and Mr. Trudeau's unpopularity in Alberta oil country, they are unlikely to win the Liberals many votes. The carbon tax may be a problem for the Liberals in the Vancouver area in particular, where gasoline prices have recently hit records highs, said Mr. Lyle. BC is not subject to the federal price on carbon due to the province already having its own regime in place. Now, just for a quick review of what they did accomplish. And I mean, when you stop and look at it, it has to be said, this government did accomplish a fair amount of what they said they would. They basically took very few breaks. They didn't have to prorogue, which is something novel to a lot of voting Canadians. Major bills passed during Justin Trudeau's first term. C6, repealing Harper-era changes to citizenship law. C14, to legalize medically assisted dying. C30, to implement the trade agreement with the EU, known as CETA. C45, to legalize cannabis. C46, which stiffened the impaired driving law. C48, to ban oil tankers from ports along the northern BC coast. C59, to establish a National Security Review Agency. C66, to expunge unjust convictions against members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and two-spirit communities. C69, to reform the environmental assessment process. C71, to reform the federal gun control regime. C75, to reform criminal sentencing requirements. C76, to limit pre-election advertising and foreign interference in elections. C79, to implement the CPTPP. C81, to promote accessibility. C91, to promote Indigenous languages. C92, to affirm the rights of Indigenous people in relation to child and family services. And C93, which they snuck in under the wire in record time, to ease criminal record suspensions for cannabis convictions. So, when you look at the big picture, facts, not feels, if you would care to classify it short, this is nowhere near the kind of stomach-turning legislative record that we saw from previous Conservative governments. Let's move on to the other factors. David Crane from the Hill Times, September 9th, NDP campaign platform remains rooted in the past. The NDP is out of the gate with its federal election campaign platform, even if it is not out of the gate when it comes to nominating candidates. Yet while it importantly raises many of the issues of inequality, injustice, and lack of opportunity facing Canadians, and identifies areas for tax reform, it fails, overall, to offer a credible set of ideas to make the country and Canadians better off. In many ways, the thinking and attitudes remain rooted in the past, heavy on income and wealth redistribution, light on income and wealth creation, and scant recognition of how radically society and the economy are changing. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh is center stage in the platform. The 109-page platform document includes 35 photos of Singh. It follows the growing trend in Canada of adopting U.S.-style presidential campaigns, building a cult of personality around the leader, rather than identifying the team who might actually be capable of forming an effective government. More importantly, the NDP platform shows that the party remains hostage to two long-standing NDP problems. First, it cannot get away from its divisive tone of moral superiority. The other parties it contends are captives of the corporate elites and the wealthy, and deliberately favor corporations and the wealthy over everyone else. The NDP stands alone in fighting for economic and social justice. People tell me I'm different from the other leaders, and I am, Singh says in his party's first campaign commercial. While others work for the wealthy, he alone works for the average Canadian, he claims. New Democrats know who we work for. While the other parties are busy working to protect big polluters, big corporations, and the richest few, New Democrats are working for you every day. But aside from the fact that it is dishonest, this old-style class warfare doesn't cut it today. We do need strong advocates for fairness and opportunity for all, a role the NDP has traditionally played and continues to do so. But claiming that conservatives and liberals are deliberately working to favor the wealthy over everyone else, as the platform repeatedly claims, is a false narrative. The NDP's second problem is that it doesn't really seem to grasp the importance of productivity as the fundamental source of rising living standards, which means its approach to economic policy is muddled. It doesn't know how it wants to deal with the private sector, distrusting big corporations, despite their importance in innovation and exports. At a time when businesses are expressing concern over weakened competitiveness due to U.S. corporate cuts, the NDP would raise Canadian corporate taxes without showing how this would affect competitiveness and hence growth and jobs. The NDP, after repeatedly attacking big corporations for gouging Canadians, acknowledges that Canadian industries power the economy and sustain the jobs that families across the country rely on, and asserts, after accusing the Liberals of kowtowing to the demands of the corporate world, that the Liberals have ignored the need to support Canadian industry and failed to invest in the targeted support that our industries need to survive. It promises a national industrial strategy to make Canada a global leader as market needs evolve. It promises as well a national auto industry summit and strategy, claims to have a plan to develop the aerospace industry, and says it supports startups and scale-ups in the tech world. But all of this is quite vague, as is its claim that it can create 300,000 good jobs in green technologies. Exactly how an NDP government would achieve its claimed ambitions for a stronger economy seems to depend on future consultations and summits with corporate leaders. Yet it assumes that its tax changes, a boost in the corporate tax rate of 3 points to return to 2010 levels, a boost in the top marginal tax rate for everyone making $210,000 a year by 2 points, a wealth tax of 1% on all individuals with more than $20 million in wealth that it claims would raise several $billion a year from the richest Canadians, and an increase in the capital gains tax to raise $3 billion more a year, again from high-income Canadians. They say all of this would not impede its ability to work with industry and investors. Yet, unless Canada can improve its productivity performance by becoming much more innovative, we will have a harder time sustaining existing social programs, including health care, as our society ages, let alone all the new social initiatives the NDP wants. At the same time, the net budgetary effect of all the social promises the NDP makes and the revenues it expects from its plans to tax high-income Canadians and corporations is far from clear. The platform claims it would lower the debt-to-GDP ratio over the next decade, but doesn't show how. Perhaps the parliamentary budget officer will tell us whether this is true or not when it examines the NDP platform. Polls suggest that many Canadians have written off the NDP in the coming election. But we need to pay attention to its platform because we need a healthy social democratic party in this country. Unfortunately, the NDP platform is more a long list of aspirations for a better Canada than a set of realistic priorities to build a stronger, fairer, and more sustainable Canada. It still has much hard work to do before it can credibly claim to be ready to form a government. that knows not only what it wants, but how, realistically, to achieve what it wants for Canada and Canadians. Abbas Rana, Hill Times, September 9th. NDP in serious difficulty. Greens could win more seats than the NDP. And Liberals and Conservatives poised for a quite ugly bare-knuckles fight, says pollster Graves. The NDP are in serious difficulty, said pollster Frank Graves, president and founder of Ecos Research, in an interview with the Hill Times. Given the numbers we have seen, it's possible the Green Party will win more seats than the NDP. According to an Ecos poll released recently, the Conservatives were 1 point ahead of the Liberals, 34 compared to 33. The Green Party was at 11, the NDP were at 10. The poll of 1,067 Canadians was conducted between August 21st to August 23rd. An Abacus data poll released last week also suggested Conservative support at 34, ahead of Liberals 33. The same poll found that 17% of Canadians supported the NDP and 9% for the Greens. So there's a big difference. That survey had 4,549 Canadians, August 23rd to 29th, and had a low margin of error of 1.5%. A Nanos Research Weekly rolling poll found the Liberals leading with 35.4 compared to 31.2 for the Conservatives. NDPs were at 15.6 and the Greens at 10.2. That was a poll of 1,000 Canadians. This means if an election were held now, the winner would form a minority government. Most polling companies do not put out seat projections based on their polls, but according to the poll aggregator 338canada.com, if an election were held today, the Liberals would win 165 seats, the Conservatives 142, the Bloc 14, the NDP 13, and the Green Party 5. That is no majority. In the last election, the Liberals won a majority with 184. Conservatives 99, NDP 44, Bloc 10, and the Greens 1. In 2011, the New Democrats made history under then-leader Jack Layton when they won the official opposition status for the first time in the party's history by winning 103 of, at that time, 308 seats. Now, the Conservatives won 166, the Liberals 34, the Bloc Québécois 4, and the Greens 1. Of these 103 seats, the NDP won 59 in Quebec. But in 2015, the NDP won only 16 in Quebec. Mr. Graves said, based on long-term trends, on average, NDP support was at around 9%, and there was no region in the country where NDP leader Jagmeet Singh and the New Democrats had a strong base of support going into the election. He described this as an astonishing decline compared to the start of the 2015 campaign when the New Democrats were hoping to form government. Mr. Graves said since winning the leadership in 2017, Mr. Singh has failed to capture the attention of Canadians. In Quebec, Mr. Graves said, another unfortunate and unfair factor that is negatively affecting the NDP is the leader's ethnicity and race. Mr. Singh is a Sikh and wears a turban, which does not go over well with some Quebecers who are against religious symbols in public life. Their problems in Quebec, which are acute, are unfortunately and unfairly connected to having selected a leader who is a Sikh, wears a turban, which for most Canadians would and should not be an issue at all. But apparently, given the current emphasis on secularism and concerns about religious symbols in Quebec, is a factor that has harmed him. But I'm going to move on to what's important. From Michael Harris in the Tyee, August 6th. Stephen Harper heads a global organization that helps get right-wing parties elected. What will it do for Andrew Scheer? Hi, I'm Sarah from the Conservative Party. Can the Conservative Party count on your support in the next federal election? Reply, yes, no. This text, sent on July 9th, landed on the cell phone of a person not on social media and who does not tweet. Reply yes, and the conversation begins. Reply no, and you go into the Conservative database as a non-supporter. Valuable information for the party either way. The text identified the sender as the Conservative Party. Perfectly legitimate. But how did the party get that cell number? The same way they got mine, I suppose. A few days later, the same message appeared on my iPhone. It all felt a little like a variation of something the country has seen before. It brought to mind the robocall scandal that tainted the 2011 federal election, which delivered Stephen Harper's Conservatives their only majority government. As someone who took a very close look at those dirty tricks, I was reminded of two other facts we should pay attention to as a new election looms. One, most people know little or nothing about a global organization called the International Democratic Union, which is dedicated to getting right-wing parties elected around the world. And two, the IDU's chairman is none other than Stephen Harper. Let us commence to connect dots. During the 2011 election, the Conservative Party's Constituent Information Management System provided useful lists for the dodgier elements of that year's election campaign. Voter lists from Sims were used to make robocalls, supposedly coming from Elections Canada, the ones telling non-supporters of the Conservative Party that their polling booth had been moved. A burner phone, prepaid vanilla payment cards, and a proxy IP server that masked the originating IP address were used in an attempt to suppress the Liberal vote. Only one person, Michael Sona, a low-level Conservative campaign worker in Guelph, was convicted of violating election laws. But the judge publicly doubted Sona had acted alone. A knowledgeable and well-placed source close to the party spoke to the Tyee on a not-for-attribution basis about those dark days. Doug Finley, who ran the Conservatives' campaigns in 2004 and 2006, learned about the robocalls technique from friends at the International Democratic Union. He declared at the time that Michael Sona could not be guilty because he, Sona, had not been briefed on the technique. They kept the details secret and never told anyone the full story of how they did it. The International Democratic Union is an intelligence resource for conservative parties around the world. They trade secrets on voter suppression and other dirty tricks. Then they come back and have their dupes do the dirty work. Senator Mike Duffy testified during his 2015 trial over expense claims that Finley had said Sona couldn't have organized the robocalls. Duffy testified Finley had said, "He hasn't taken our courses. He wouldn't know enough to do this." Finley closely associated with the IDU until his death in May 2013 was a key conservative strategist and operative. He's widely credited with being the mastermind behind the federal conservative breakthrough in 2004 and the party's electoral victories in 2006 and 2008. Harper appointed Finley to the Senate while he was under active investigation by Elections Canada for violating the electoral rules, a sign that the Prime Minister was untroubled by any of Finley's activities. Can you imagine the shitstorm if Trudeau had done something like that? The case dogging Finley revolved around what came to be known as the in-and-out scandal. During the 2006 election, riding funds were improperly channeled into national advertising, allowing the party to overspend on the election by more than $1 million in the last days of the campaign. Some people, including journalist Glenn McGregor, believe that it won the election for Harper. Side note, the Riding Association of Andrew Scheer took part in that festivity. Finley was eventually charged, along with 3 other senior party members, but the charges against these individuals were dropped. Under a negotiated deal, the Conservative Party and its fundraising arm pled guilty to exceeding spending limits and filing fraudulent election records. The CPC paid a fine of just over $230,000. Jenny Byrne, Jenny the Impaler, was Finley's deputy and took over as the Conservative Party's Director of Political Operations in 2009. The party sent operatives to the United States to study how the Republican Party political machine works. Voter suppression was a routine dirty trick among U.S. politicians on the right. They understood that their chances of success went up when the number of voters went down. Historically in the U.S., Democrats win when voter turnout is high, Republicans when it's low. The Conservative Party of Canada is closely aligned with the Republican Party, and both are closely associated with the International Democratic Union. A case in point, in March 2012, the CBC reported that 14 Conservative MPs in Canada had signed on with a well-connected Republican company during the 2011 federal election, front porch strategies. The party initially denied any involvement. Front porch strategies, based in Columbus, Ohio, boasted that it won all 14 of the races it was associated with in Canada. Front Porch worked for the Conservative caucus, as well as individual MPs. Front Porch had worked for Republican presidential campaigns, as well as the Republican National Committee. It had also been active in trying to overturn Roe v. Wade, the 1973 ruling that gave American women the right to abortions without undue interference from government. The Conservative Party also used the far-flung resources of the IDU, the largest organization of its kind on the planet. The IDU offers, for example, election technology seminars on a regular basis, and it conducts campaign seminars for politicians and party workers. These involve exchanges of information on campaign technology, fundraising techniques, opinion polling, advertising, and campaign organization. The Conservative Party of Canada has hosted the IDU's Standing Committee on Elections and Campaigns in Ottawa. In March 2012, campaign directors from IDU members in 11 countries met in Ottawa. Among the many Conservative Party of Canada politicians who have played key roles in the IDU is former Conservative MP Tony Clement, who was elected its vice chairman, serving in that capacity from 2011 to 2014. What might he know about campaign tactics taught at IDU events, and do they include the fine points of voter suppression? Can't say. Clement declined an interview for this piece. It is unclear who funds the IDU, but the connection to wealthy Republicans known for their financial support of conservative causes is clear. There is one outstanding example. The treasurer of the IDU is Mike Roman of the U.S. Republican Party. Roman is also a former employee of the Koch brothers. According to the New York Times, the billionaire siblings broke up their 25-person opposition research unit in April 2016 as an efficiency measure. According to Politico, Mike Roman ran that operation. Before it was disbanded, the unit gathered intelligence on liberal political opponents, environmental groups, and unions. Roman's job was to oversee opposition research, deep investigations to uncover damaging information on opponents of the Republicans. Roman, who considered himself to be a private investigator, was paid $286,000 in 2016. He keeps a decidedly low profile. Those mega-rich brothers who once employed IDU Treasurer Roman invest deeply in ideological policy champions who serve their business aims. The Kochs contribute, for example, to one of Harper's favorite organizations, the Fraser Institute, and they reportedly spent $20 million to get tax changes under Trump that saved them over $1 billion. They also spent almost $900 million on policy and political battles heading into the 2016 presidential election that saw Trump win. The Kochs were able to do this because tax-exempt nonprofit groups in the U.S. can accept unlimited cash without exposing donors or facing spending restrictions, then flow it to political groups. Harper tried to mimic that U.S. system when he was head of the National Citizens Coalition, a right-wing lobby group promoting conservative causes. Harper took the issue of unlimited spending for third-party organizations, which makes cash king in American politics, all the way to the Supreme Court in Canada, when he was head of the NCC. He lost. There is another tactic we've seen in the U.S. that Stephen Harper and his conservatives also employed, claiming voter fraud in order to mess with voting. Which brings us back to Mike Roman. After he left the Koch brothers' intelligence operation, Roman showed up running candidate Donald Trump's election protection. Roman oversaw poll-watching efforts and voter turnout, primarily in the key electoral college state of Pennsylvania. Weeks before the 2016 vote, Trump claimed without evidence that dead people and undocumented immigrants were voting. Afterwards, he attributed Hillary Clinton's victory in the popular vote to fraudulent votes, 3 to 5 million of them. He said voter fraud was particularly rampant in Philadelphia, St. Louis, and Chicago. No evidence for the claim was ever produced. Trump nevertheless launched an investigation after winning the White House, which quickly folded. That's in part because 44 states refused to hand over highly sensitive and politically useful information that the Commission was requesting. In 2011, the Conservative Party of Canada also tried to claim voter fraud was a big problem in Canada, a ruse that gave justification for the Harper government to bring in the Fair Elections Act, a piece of legislation that critics claimed made it harder to vote and easier to cheat. The Trudeau government has since rescinded major parts of this legislation. After the 2016 election, Roman quietly went to work for the White House as a special assistant and director of special projects and research. At the end of April 2018, Roman left the Trump administration. The Republican National Committee now reportedly is paying him $20,000 a month for legal and compliance services. That would be the Mike Roman who once wrote in a blog entry, "If an election is worth winning, then there is someone willing to steal it." Stephen Harper resides in Calgary and is chairman and chief executive officer of Harper and Associates, a global consulting firm. In February 2018 in Madrid, Harper was elected chairman of the IDU. Formerly based in Oslo, the organization is now based in Munich. Harper did not respond to a request for interview. At the time of his election, Harper released a statement saying, "I look forward to working with IDU leaders and members globally to strengthen relationships, advance our political values, and share best practices for campaigning and governing." The IDU website says Harper has overseen a dramatic deepening of relations with India. The right-wing Hindu nationalist ruling BJP party joined the IDU in February 2016. The party saw a significant increase in support in the May 23, 2019 election, upping the number of seats in their majority government from 282 to 303. India is the world's largest democracy, and as an IDU member, it will be able to promote similar ideology around the world. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, hard-right party Likud, became the 73rd member of the IDU in 2018. The party's initiation was marked by a ceremony at the Ronald Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California, presided over by Harper. In July, the IDU congratulated member Nea Demokratia for that Conservative Party's election win in Greece. Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis immediately vowed to slash taxes and accept austerity measures imposed by the European Union. As head of the IDU, Stephen Harper also personally congratulated Viktor Orban, a man Maclean's called one of the most alarming right-wing populists in Europe. Harper said that he and the IDU looked forward to working with Orban, who has been widely criticized for his anti-immigrant policies and co-option of the courts and electoral system in Hungary. The EU has just taken Hungary to the European Court of Justice for passing legislation that makes it a crime to assist asylum seekers. Now, here in Canada, Andrew Scheer has an important ally in his quest for a majority government. The new chairman of the IDU, his old boss, Stephen Harper. Harper is no longer in elected politics, but more political than ever. He has roasted the Trudeau government over its alleged animus against the West's energy industry, claiming that it has no intention of building the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion that Canadians now own. He paid a secret visit to the White House without the courtesy of informing the Canadian government what he was doing there. And he has already penned fundraising emails for Andrew Scheer. As Alec Castonguay reported in L'Actualité, Scheer rarely makes an important decision without consulting his former leader. Meanwhile, the high-tech stalking of voters goes on in Canada. Responsive Marketing Group, the company whose name came up during the 2011 robocall scandal, appears to be behind current text to people in BC and Ontario. The text asks for people's thoughts on pipelines and the carbon tax. The calls were traced back to iMarketing Solutions Incorporated, founded by the directors of Responsive Marketing Group. iMarketing has offices in Toronto and New Mexico. That raises an intriguing question. Have the Conservatives been sending texts through iMarketing without identifying who paid for the marketing? The party did something similar for the 2013 Saskatchewan push polls sent out by Rack9, the company that made the infamous robocalls in the 2011 election. In the Saskatchewan case 2 years later, the Conservatives at first denied that the messages were sent by the party. Once they were outed, the party fessed up and paid a $78,000 fine. According to Elections Canada records, RMG worked on 97 Conservative campaigns across the country in 2011, as well as the national campaign. The company had even worked with Sims as it was developed in 2003. Remember the late Senator Finley discussed early in this piece? He called RMG the best in the business. The Conservatives won one of the ridings called by RMG by 18 votes. Global Affairs Canada officials are worried that foreign countries such as Russia or Saudi Arabia could manipulate Canadians with disinformation in the 2019 federal election using artificial intelligence. Divisive tactics include theft of private data for publication, fake news, personalized propaganda, micro-targeting ads, and trolling. A question then, for you and me. Are Canadians about to see a bag of dirty tricks in the 2019 federal campaign similar to what went on in the last U.S. election? Elections Canada rules can't keep up with technology, especially if people are going to push the boundaries of what is legal. As events in the past have shown, the people pushing these boundaries often have more money and technology than election bureaucrats. One more question. This for Andrew Scheer and Stephen Harper. That message on my cell leaves me wondering, Steve and Andy, do you know who Sarah is and how she got my phone number? Thank you, Michael Harris. I looked at the people selected to run the national campaigns for all the parties. For the most part, there's reasons they got the position, be it through the party system or being recognized in their field, what have you. One stands out. I'm only going to talk about one. From August 8th in Maclean's by John Geddes, Hamish Marshall's plan to win election 2019 for Andrew Scheer. When Justin Trudeau was hurting in the polls this past spring, the obvious tack for the Conservatives was to stick with what was working. The outcry over the SNC-Lavalin affair had the Liberals reeling. The opposition's job, it seemed, was just to keep its focus relentlessly on allegations that the Prime Minister and his aides had improperly pressured Jody Wilson-Raybould. Yet the Conservatives opted, at least temporarily, to switch channels. They had planned, long before Wilson-Raybould quit Trudeau's cabinet and then was kicked out of his caucus, to make the federal carbon tax their big issue for 2019. So, sticking to that script, the party made news in late March with a massed text message blast to voters in New Brunswick, Ontario, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, reminding them that the tax was kicking in on April 1st in their provinces. Some harried Liberals welcomed the change of topic. It was a classic Hamish Marshall moment. Staying the course is what Conservative leader Andrew Scheer's campaign manager is all about. He's got a plan. He's going to be disciplined and stick to that plan, says Matthew John, an old friend of Marshall's and a longtime Conservative insider. It's harder than people think because you don't know if you're right until the end. Of course, the end Marshall is driving toward is the October 21st federal election. And hammering the carbon tax, no matter what distractions arise, is central to his script. Back in 2016, when Scheer recruited Marshall to manage his bid for the Conservative leadership, the duo didn't strike anyone as particularly intimidating. A former House Speaker without any obvious flair, backed by an owlish data nerd whose firm designed and hosted websites for politicians and groups. They had bonded nearly 2 decades ago as novice Parliament Hill staffers and had stayed close, attending each other's weddings. On why he signed on to back Scheer, Marshall says simply, "My friend called and asked for help." That seems straightforward enough, but for Marshall, making any political decision that's not grounded in meticulous research isn't normal. Conservatives who have worked closely with him uniformly stress how he's driven by information, especially demographic analysis of voters. He's not interested in flying blind, says James Moore, who served in former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's cabinet and has known Marshall for nearly 2 decades. The fuel of politics for him has to be data, not fantasy or aspirational statements. Rodney Wilfred, if Marshall's decision to back Scheer started with warm feelings, he ran his leadership campaign with cool discipline. Maxime Bernier led through most of the race, presenting Scheer and Marshall with continuous temptation to attack the flamboyant front-runner. But Marshall's game plan was to present Scheer as a unifier, so they mostly held their fire. In a contest decided by ranked ballot voting, selling Scheer to his rival supporters as an inoffensive second choice proved crucial to his come-from-behind victory. Not surprisingly, Scheer turned to Marshall to helm his first campaign as Conservative leader. It's a job Marshall seems to have been building toward for a long time. He served in Harper's PMO and then as Conservative pollster in Harper's successful 2008 federal campaign. Arguably even more telling is the way Marshall orchestrated the no sides win in a fiercely fought Vancouver referendum over a proposed transit tax in 2015. It's all been enough for Marshall, 41, to establish himself as among the most respected Tory backroom figures. Striving to make Scheer 40 Prime Minister, though, poses a far greater challenge. They bring shared baggage to the task. When they met as junior Hill staffers after the 2000 federal election, the Canadian right was going through the tortuous task of healing the split between reformers and progressive conservatives, which culminated in the creation of the new Conservative Party of Canada in 2003. Those formative years during the Unite the Right efforts instilled a deep aversion to internal divisions in Scheer, Marshall, and others of the generation. Harper's genius was to keep the new Conservative Party united under his incremental leadership, and Marshall remains an unabashed fan. I was excited to work with a leader whose views line up with mine on many, many things, he said in an interview. As well, the Harper era provided openings for a data-driven, tech-savvy strategist to make his name. After the Conservatives won the 2006 election, Marshall served as the PMO's Director of Strategic Planning and then went on to work in polling, advertising, and website services. He's now on leave from his partner's position at One Persuasion Incorporated, a public affairs consulting firm where he specializes in polling. One more piece about the Conservatives. This was in The Star on September 2nd. This is from Smokey Thomas, who is the president of OPSEU, Ontario Provincial Services Employees Union. Scheer's election slogan undermines the Canadian way. They say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. But let's be real. We all do it, and with good reason. A book's cover tells you a lot about the tone, ideals, and values that you'll find within. The same goes for a political party's election slogan. Judging by the slogan chosen by the Conservatives, they're promising to dismantle the very foundations of what has always made Canada great. Life isn't a competition, but by choosing time for you to get ahead as their slogan, that's how the Conservatives want you to see it. It begs the question, get ahead of who? Definitely not the rich. The Conservatives' long, sorry history of lavishing tax cuts on the wealthy and the corporations they own makes that crystal clear. So if it's not the rich, it must be the rest of us. In other words, the Conservatives want you to look at your friends, your family, and your neighbors as competitors to get ahead of. They want you to look at others as a threat to your own prosperity, happiness, and success. Has a party ever pitched a sadder, more cynical vision for the future of our country? Has the Conservative Party ever sunk lower? Time for you to get ahead is like saying that if your neighbor's house is on fire, go ahead and throw gas on the flames. You definitely get ahead of them then. That's not what our society was built on. When a neighbor is in need, our first impulse is to rush in to help, not capitalize on their need. This has been proven time and time again. Just this week, a poll came out showing that a clear majority of Canadians have a positive view of socialism. We want less focus on individualism, not more. But a slogan like, "Time for you to get ahead," appeals to people's darker impulses and threatens to undermine everything that makes Canada so Canadian. The Conservatives haven't always tried to pit us against each other. It wasn't so long ago, for example, that Sir Adam Beck brought Ontario together to build a public hydro system that provided a century of affordable power to all, or that Bill Davis brought us together to build a public college system, the great equalizer. Even Mike Harris knew it was better to give a hand up than a hand out. But Andrew Scheer has turned his back on that history. Instead, he's following the lead of populist politicians like Donald Trump and Doug Ford, who dismantle public services and abandon social responsibility by preaching me instead of we. Scheer could have chosen the slogan, "Time for us to get ahead," but he didn't. I'm going to judge Scheer's book by its cover. For the sake of our country, I urge you to do the same. There's one last thing I wanted to touch on tonight. This wasn't going to be a part of the show until basically late last night, when the latest, I don't know what to call it, story from Robert Fife came out regarding the RCMP, SNC-Lavalin, and a lot of idle speculation. It's behind a paywall, first of all. So there is this explosive, bombastic headline that's behind a paywall. So right away, the number of people that will be aware of this article that can actually read it is very small. So you put the headline out, and then people can't read it. There's no context. There's no follow-up. It's just making a statement, but you can't see it, so whatever. Just accept it. Well, you can see it if you want to give us money. How typical. The other factor involved is you get the usual circle jerk of right-wing media to spread it on social media and say, "What a fantastic article. Oh my God, look what's happening," and link it. But if you're not behind the paywall, too bad. So it's false praise, but I do have a copy of it. So I'm going to read it, and I'm going to insert some reason into it. It is very vague. There is nothing new at all in this so-called bombshell. There's nothing in it from a factual perspective that was not known earlier. It is my opinion that this article was written some time ago, and it was sitting in the can waiting to be dropped the night before the election writ is issued, because when that happens, all the rules about money spent and what you say change. That's why it was dropped the night before the writ. And as far as my depth of countering what this article says, I will guarantee you that I put as much background into it as Bob Fife did. I guarantee that. Ottawa blocks RCMP on SNC-Lavalin inquiry. In the Globe and Mail, from Daniel LeBlanc, Parliamentary Affairs reporter, and Robert Fife, Ottawa Bureau Chief, published September 10th. The RCMP has been looking into potential obstruction of justice in the handling of the prosecution of SNC-Lavalin Group Incorporated, but its examination has been stymied by the federal government's refusal to lift cabinet confidentiality for all witnesses, the Globe and Mail has learned. There's absolutely nothing new in that statement. Nothing at all. This means individuals involved in the matter cannot discuss events or share documents with police that have not been exempted from the role of cabinet confidentiality, according to sources who the Globe agreed not to identify so they could discuss the RCMP inquiries. How convenient for you. As the SNC-Lavalin scandal to create a scandal began, there is no identifiable source. Just trust us. In Canada, the principle of cabinet confidentiality is intended to allow ministers to debate decisions freely in private. As a result, discussions involving cabinet matters must be kept secret unless a waiver is granted. In the SNC matter, the Liberals say that the clerk of the Privy Council, who heads the bureaucratic agency that serves the Prime Minister's office, made the decision not to offer a broad waiver to either the RCMP or to the Ethics Commissioner, and that the PMO played no role. Yes, that is the principle of cabinet confidentiality, as it has been forever. In the SNC matter, the Liberals say that the Clerk of the Privy Council made the decision. Them's the rules. That's the way it's always been. And to call the Clerk of the Privy Council serves the PMO, the Clerk of the Privy Council also serves the ministers in the Privy Council. They also have a duty to protect the legal standing of the ministers, not just the PMO. So when they refuse to release cabinet confidentiality, it's not protecting the PMO per se. It's protecting the PMO and the ministers and the institution of the Privy Council. That's how it works, which Mr. Fife well knows. A source who was recently interviewed by the RCMP told the Globe that investigators indicated they are looking into possible obstruction of justice. Source, unnamed, told, no documentation, indicated. What the hell does indicated mean? Looking into possible? What horse shit? The criminal code says obstruction of justice occurs when an effort is made to obstruct, pervert, or defeat the course of justice in a judicial proceeding. Yeah, so? Notice judicial proceeding. The entire question of the Department of Public Prosecutions on whether to proceed with a deferred prosecution agreement is not a judicial proceeding. But I guess that's a detail. The National Police Force will pause the operation because of the coming election campaign. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is scheduled to go to Rideau Hall Wednesday to ask the Governor-General to dissolve Parliament and call the vote for October 21st. And the RCMP has a policy to suspend politically sensitive operations during campaigns. Well, yeah, that's how it works for any government. But be sure to mention that this is Trudeau's government, because apparently that matters. Justice Department spokesman Ian MacLeod said the decision not to offer a broader waiver for the RCMP was made solely by the Clerk of the Privy Council as guardian of cabinet confidences. Yeah, Mr. Trudeau's Director of Communications, Cameron Ahmed, said the PMO was not involved in the decision. Yeah, Ethics Commissioner Mario Dion faced the same obstacles as the RCMP in his investigation into the SNC Lavalin affair earlier this year, stating in his final report that 9 witnesses were unable to provide full testimony because government allowed only a limited waiver on cabinet secrecy. Yeah, he didn't put it in there because he was bitching. He put it in there because that's part of his mandate. And why is there no mention of the fact that no cabinet has ever granted a full waiver? This is the largest cabinet waiver ever granted. No mention of all the Harper bullshit. No mention of the Chrétien bullshit. Mr. Dion found that Mr. Trudeau breached the Conflict of Interest Act. His report said that the Prime Minister and senior federal officials improperly pressed Jody Wilson-Raybould when she was Justice Minister and Attorney General to order the Director of Public Prosecutions to settle bribery and fraud charges against SNC-Lavalin without a trial. To say that's a bit of a stretch of what Mr. Dion said is an understatement, but notice how it also says absolutely nothing about all the comments and opinions that came forth in the days after the Dion report that the Commissioner had in fact misinterpreted Section 9 of the Conflict of Interest Act. Notice how that's not mentioned at all. And that's exactly why the Dion report faded away so fast. The Department of Justice confirmed Tuesday that the RCMP received the same access to cabinet confidences and privileged information as the Ethics Commissioner and the Justice Committee of the House. Yeah, so? Oh, I see. It's just to kind of drum up this background music like Jaws, that there's something nefarious going on. An order in council dated February 25th offered a waiver to Ms. Wilson-Raybould and any persons who directly participated in discussions with her about the prosecution of SNC-Lavalin during her time as Attorney General. She was moved to Veterans Affairs on January 14th. The waiver allowed Ms. Wilson-Raybould to talk to the Justice Committee and the Ethics Commissioner, but did not extend further. So, the Ethics Commissioner's report said a number of discussions between members of the PMO, ministerial staffers, and officials at SNC-Lavalin were conducted without Ms. Wilson-Raybould's knowledge, and therefore were not covered by the waiver. Okay. The former minister is running as an independent in the riding of Vancouver-Granville. Nice plug there, Bob. How to slip that in, not too obvious. The RCMP has not officially launched a criminal investigation. Now, I take you back to the title of this article. Ottawa blocks RCMP on SNC-Lavalin inquiry. So, more than halfway through the article. The RCMP has not officially launched a criminal investigation. The police force has said it is examining this matter carefully with all available information. The examination is in the hands of the RCMP's National Division, which is in charge of sensitive cases. Blah, blah, blah. That is known as A Division, for people interested in that fact. So we have that statement of basically, the sky is blue. It will continue to be blue in the future. From there, we go, last month, Conservative leader Anders Scheer said significant grounds existed for an investigation into whether Mr. Trudeau's action constituted obstructing justice based on nothing. Opinion. Partisan soundbite. But be sure to throw it in. And don't say that he can say whatever he wants. Doesn't matter. Former RCMP Commissioner Bob Paulson, who retired in 2017, said it will be difficult for the Mounties to complete their examination unless the government waives cabinet confidentiality entirely, which has never been done by any government. And then I guess your job has been difficult forever, right, Bob? The government is entitled to assert privilege. If the RCMP were serious enough, they could probably get a search warrant, but that would probably be shot down by the courts. The privilege is pretty strong at the cabinet level. I have not had an experience where we succeeded in getting cabinet documents that the government didn't want us to have. Yeah, Bob, that's called the Constitution? He added, in my experience, particularly, cabinet privilege is over-asserted, and I guess more widely applied than it's deserved. That is absolute opinion. And why didn't the RCMP, under his leadership, go to court then, from 2011 to 2017? Like there was nothing the Harper government did between 2011 to 2017 that would merit the National Police Force trying to get all information relevant on whether that government committed criminal activity. Fuck off, Bob. Ridiculous. Mr. Paulson, who said he has no information on the RCMP probe, said it makes sense that the Mounties would focus on obstruction of justice. It strikes me there is sufficient information to be pursued. One need to only read the section of the criminal code on the elements of the offense and to put that against what the public record is, and I think you have something that needs to be explored. So, like any other obstruction charge? Great call, Bob. Mr. Paulson said the RCMP brought in new rules after an investigation came to light during the 2005 election campaign that may have contributed to the defeat of the Liberal government of Paul Martin. During the campaign, the RCMP sent a letter to the NDP saying it would conduct a criminal probe into allegations that Liberals leaked information to the financial markets on how they intended to handle the taxation of income trusts. The force later announced that it would avoid discussing criminal investigations during election campaigns. Oops. Gee, I can't imagine why any clerk of the Privy Council would have an issue with just letting you guys in and take whatever you want when you did something like this in the past. Mr. Paulson said, we have a sensitive investigation policy that addresses this very thing. What's this we? You don't belong to the RCMP anymore. If the writ is dropped, and particularly during the writ period, unless there is some compelling public reason to keep investigating, they are not going to keep investigating. Certainly if they are, they would be wise to just shut up about it. The RCMP started looking into the SNC-Lavalin issue after the Globe revealed on February 7th that officials in the PMO put pressure on Ms. Wilson-Raybould to order prosecutors to negotiate a deferred prosecution agreement in the case, which would avoid a trial in exchange for financial settlement. Considering Bob Fife wrote that article and he's writing this one, I find that to be an extremely poor summary of what happened there. But hey, whatever. Now we're going to bounce back around to the Ethics Commissioner. In his report, Mr. Dion said that he had been hampered from conducting a full investigation because 9 witnesses were prevented from sharing information they felt was relevant. In the present examination, I have gathered sufficient factual information to properly determine the matter on its merits, he wrote. Because of the inability to access all cabinet confidences related to the matter, I must, however, report that I was unable to fully discharge the investigatory duties conferred upon me by the Conflict of Interest Act. So just like every investigation before it. Thanks. These 9 people, whom he did not identify, how conveniently, told him revealing this information would breach cabinet confidentiality. The Privy Council rejected Mr. Dion's request for a waiver. Now this line is very interesting. A lawyer for Mr. Trudeau, well, the guy doesn't have a name, you can't say what his capacity is, why he's even involved. Just keep it all dark and spooky. A lawyer for Mr. Trudeau told Mr. Dion the Prime Minister played no role in Privy Council Clerk Ian Shugart's decision to deny the request. Well, that's true. Still, Mr. Trudeau has publicly supported the decision. The decision by the Privy Council to not further extend into less relevant or non-relevant elements of cabinet confidentiality or solicitor-client privilege is an important one that maintains the integrity of our institutions and our capacity to function as a government without setting troublesome or worrisome precedents. That is a very important statement. Once you change the rules, you change them for everybody to follow. We see the results of how that works in the U.S. Mr. Paulson said RCMP investigators are entitled to talk to any witnesses, but they can't compel people to talk to them if the government refused to waive cabinet confidentiality. It is up to the people to either assert privilege or decline to talk to us. My philosophy has been to be aggressive in pursuing the people who had information and then having them assert whatever reason they had not to talk to us. The witnesses generally talk to police unless they were protecting privilege. So, in the first line of that paragraph, we have Fife saying that Paulson said, and alluding that it was, if people won't talk, it's because they don't have a waiver. Then when he quotes Paulson himself, Paulson says it's either because they don't have a waiver or they don't want to talk to us. That's called Section 13 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That right is available to a shoplifter or somebody in the Prime Minister's office. Funny how these little details are left out by Fife the Knife. Chicken shit, clickbait, revenue-generating journalism. Brought to you by the Thompson family. One final thing. This is from today. This is in the National Post. Baloney meter. Is the RCMP investigating people in the PMO over SNC-Lavalin? Conservative leader Andrew Scheer on September 11th, today, said, clearly the RCMP are taking this seriously enough to start investigating individuals in the Prime Minister's office. Of course, Scheer was eager to talk about this Fife-adelia as he prepared to board his campaign plane today on an issue that threatens to haunt Liberal leader Justin Trudeau. The Globe and Mail published a story late the night before the election was called, saying the RCMP has been looking into potential obstruction of justice in the SNC-Lavalin affair, and that the federal police force was not granted access to any more materials than Ethics Commissioner Mario Dion had received as he conducted his own examination. So in other words, everything's going the way it's supposed to, and always has. Dion's report, released last month, concluded Trudeau had contravened the Conflict of Interest Act when he tried to pressure former Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould into intervening to head off criminal proceedings on corruption charges against the Montreal engineering giant. Is the RCMP really investigating people in the PMO during an election campaign? The RCMP has never said it is investigating the Liberal government, or, as Scheer claimed, people in the PMO, in relation to the SNC-Lavalin affair. The most the National Police Force said, when everyone was looking for a reaction to the report from the Ethics Commissioner, was that it was examining this matter carefully with all available information and would follow up if need be. Now that an election campaign is officially underway, the RCMP is saying even less. Unfortunately, we are not in a position to confirm anything in that regard at this time, said Stephanie Dumoulin, a spokeswoman for the RCMP A Division. The Liberal campaign flatly denied anyone in the PMO has been called up by the RCMP. No member of staff has been contacted and no materials have been requested. Joe Piccaro, a Liberal campaign spokesman, said in an email when asked to respond to the statement by Scheer. The response applies to both current and former staffers. Later, today, Wednesday, the Liberal campaign added the RCMP has not contacted Trudeau, Finance Minister Bill Morneau, or Justice Minister David Lametti. Trudeau has defended himself by insisting he was acting in the best interests of Canadians. The Conservative campaign, meanwhile, said Scheer was basing his statement on the information in the story, on Fife's bullshit story. Spokesman for the Conservative Party, Simon Jeffries, says the story refers to investigators. Investigators investigate things. The Trudeau Liberals are playing ridiculous word games. Oh, the Liberals are they? One of the problems is that investigation can mean different things to different people, even the police. The only person to have gone on the record about having been contacted by the RCMP over how the Liberals handled SNC-Lavalin is Jody Wilson-Raybould. She confirmed the RCMP contacted her about the issue in the spring. Wilson-Raybould told the Globe and Mail today she had been interviewed by RCMP officers earlier this week and has had other telephone conversations with the police since Dion's report came out. The timing of the spring contact with the RCMP also suggests no official investigation was underway. Now, this is the important part here. The Conflict of Interest Act requires the Federal Ethics Commissioner to immediately suspend his own examination if he learns the police have launched an investigation into the same issue, or if related charges have been laid. The Ethics Commissioner must be allowed that process to run its course before he can resume his own probe. That never happened, as Dion began his investigation the day after the Globe and Mail published its first story on the allegations and kept going until he published his report 6 months later. It is clear that Scheer is trying to suggest that where there is smoke, there is fire. That does not mean it was accurate for him to say what he did with such certainty. For those reasons, Scheer's assertion that the RCMP has started investigating people in the PMO contains a lot of baloney. It is mostly inaccurate, but contains an element of truth. Welcome to Hamish Marshall World. All right, that's it for tonight. I hope you learned what the bigger picture is for the parties and for the people who make their living off the parties. Hopefully this will be the only election episode that has nothing to do with people and voting. But I found it important. Be vigilant, people. Truth matters. Facts, not feels. We'll see you next week. Scheduled guest is Tim McSorley from International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. Next week, we're going to talk about civil rights, digital rights, the platforms, and where Canada's headed. Have fun on the campaign trail, people. See you next week. Thanks for listening. Good night.